If you had woken up in the year 1723 inside a narrow wooden house in Boston, your first sensation would not have been freedom. It would have been cold. Not the polite thermostat-controlled chill of a modern morning, not the kind you fix with a heavier blanket. This cold would have crawled into your lungs during the night, settled in your joints, stiffened your fingers before your eyes even opened. It would have carried the smell of damp wood, stale smoke, unwashed wool, and something faintly metallic from the harbour wind pushing in through cracks in the boards. And before you had time to stretch, before you could wonder what day it was, the sound would arrive. Church bells, not gentle, commanding. In 1720s Boston, the bell did not suggest your schedule, it controlled it. Before we step fully into that world, take a moment. Smash like if you're ready to travel back in time. Subscribe if you crave history the way it really felt, and comment your location. I want to know where in the modern world you're watching from while we step into one that smelled of smoke, salt, and fear. Because the truth is this: everyday life in 1720s Boston was not the quaint colonial postcard we imagine. It was rigid, suspicious, loud, dirty, deeply religious, intensely political, and constantly on edge. The popular image of early colonial America is one of charming cobblestone streets and cheerful merchants tipping their hats beneath clear blue skies. But the reality was a society balanced precariously between prosperity and panic. One bad harvest, one outbreak, one rumour away from chaos. You would step outside into streets barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. The ground beneath your boots would not be pavement. It would be churned mud mixed with horse manure, fish guts discarded from the docks, and ash from last night's hearth fires. Chickens might dart between your legs. A dog might growl from a doorway. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer would strike iron in relentless rhythm. And above it all, always, the smell of the harbour. Salt water, tar, wet rope, rotting seaweed, cargo from distant lands. Boston in the 1720s was a port town, alive with trade flowing across the Atlantic Ocean from Great Britain and the Caribbean. Ships arrived heavy with molasses, rum, textiles, tea and news. They left carrying timber, fish, and the growing ambitions of a colony that was beginning, quietly, to question its place in the empire. But that questioning had not yet become rebellion, not openly. In these streets, loyalty to the crown was expected. Public dissent could destroy you. Religion was not a private matter. It was a legal framework, a moral scoreboard, a social weapon. If you overslept and missed Sunday meeting, your absence would be noticed. If you dressed too lavishly, whispers would follow you. If you spoke too boldly, you might find yourself fined, or worse, isolated. Community was survival, but community was also surveillance. Imagine standing in the marketplace. The wind slices through your coat. A woman beside you haggles fiercely over the price of corn. A fisherman unloads barrels nearby, his hands cracked and bleeding from salt exposure. A child coughs, a deep, rattling cough that makes heads turn, because disease is never far away. Smallpox haunted Boston in waves. When it arrived, it did not knock politely. It tore through households, left scars on faces, stole children from cribs. In 1721, just a few years into the decade, a smallpox epidemic would ignite one of the most explosive medical and moral debates the colony had ever seen. Fear was not abstract here. It was personal. It lived in the body. You would feel it when a ship docked after months at sea. You would wonder what it carried besides cargo. You would watch sailors disembark and scan their skin for signs: lesions, fever, weakness. Life expectancy was short. A 40-year-old man was considered aged. A woman who survived multiple childbirths was quietly regarded as resilient. even miraculous. Yet amid this fragility, ambition thrived. Merchants dreamed of wealth. Preachers dreamed of moral purity. Enslaved Africans, forcibly brought into this port economy, dreamed of something far more fundamental: freedom. Yes, slavery existed in Boston, not in sprawling plantations like the South would later become infamous for, but woven into households and docks. Enslaved men loaded ships. Enslaved women laboured in kitchens. Their presence was visible, normalised, rarely questioned in public discourse, and that normalisation is part of the discomfort. Because everyday life here was structured by hierarchies so deeply embedded, they felt natural. God above all, king beneath God, ministers interpreting both, men above women, white above black, wealth above poverty. Step into a tavern as dusk falls, candles flicker against smoke-stained beams, the air hums with rumour. Political pamphlets circulate hand to hand. Voices rise over mugs of ale brewed locally and consumed quickly. Here, ideas slip out more freely than they do under the stern gaze of church elders. This is where resistance begins, not as revolution, but as conversation. But even in these dim rooms, danger lingers. Public drunkenness can lead to public punishment. Insults can escalate into duels. Debts can land you in prison. Yes, prison. Debt imprisonment was common. Fail to repay what you owe, and you might find yourself confined in a cold cell, dependent on family to bring food. Freedom was conditional here, tied to productivity, obedience, conformity. The illusion of simplicity fades quickly, doesn't it? Because this was not a sleepy village of cheerful colonists building a wholesome new world. It was a pressure chamber, a place where religious intensity collided with Enlightenment ideas drifting across the Atlantic, where merchants accumulated wealth from global trade networks tied to exploitation, where mothers prayed over feverish children while ministers thundered about divine judgment from pulpits. The town itself was small, only about 10,000 residents by the mid-1720s, but psychologically it was enormous. Every choice echoed, every scandal spread. Privacy barely existed. At night, darkness was total. No electric glow softened the edges. Once hearth fires dimmed and candles burned low, shadows swallowed the streets. The harbour creaked with shifting ships. Somewhere, a watchman called the hour into the blackness. You would lie in bed listening for footsteps, listening for the wind, listening for coughs from the next room, and you would understand something modern comfort allows us to forget. Survival here required constant vigilance. Yet, despite it all, or perhaps because of it, people loved, laughed, built, and hoped. They stitched dresses by candlelight. They taught children to read scripture. They carved ships from timber that would cross oceans. They argued passionately about theology and governance as if the future depended on it, because in ways they couldn't yet see, it did. What everyday life was really like in 1720s, Boston was not a gentle prelude to American greatness. It was a crucible, a world of mud and sermons, salt air and suspicion, ambition and anxiety. And as we move deeper into this decade, we'll leave the distant overview behind. Next, we won't observe from above. We will wake up inside it. You wake before the sun, not because you want to, but because the cold insists. The fire in the hearth collapsed into grey ash sometime in the night, and now the air inside the room bites at your nose and ears. Your breath forms a faint cloud above the thin wool blanket pulled tight beneath your chin. The mattress beneath you is stuffed with straw that rustles every time you shift your weight. Somewhere in the darkness, a sibling coughs. From downstairs you hear the faint creak of wood as someone rises first, likely your mother. The year is 1724, the place is Boston, and this is not a special day. That's the point. There are no grand speeches this morning. No revolutionary banners fluttering outside your window, no dramatic music swelling in the background, just routine, repetition, survival. You sit up slowly, pulling on stockings that feel stiff from yesterday's sweat and smoke. Your fingers ache as you lace your shoes. There is no privacy in this room. Beds are shared, bodies arranged carefully for warmth during winter months. Personal space is a luxury unknown to you. When you descend the narrow wooden stairs, the house smells of last night's embers being coaxed back to life. Your mother kneels by the hearth, blowing gently into a cluster of sparks until they glow orange. She adds kindling. The flame grows. Warmth returns in slow negotiation. Breakfast is not indulgent. It is fuel. Perhaps porridge made from cornmeal. Perhaps coarse brown bread spread with a thin layer of butter, if the cow has been productive. There is no coffee yet steaming in every household. Tea exists but is expensive, imported, political even. More likely you drink small beer, weakly fermented, safer than water that may carry unseen danger. The taste is sour and flat. You swallow it anyway. Outside, the sky lightens from black to deep blue. The harbour wind finds every crack in the wooden walls. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster announces the inevitable. The day has begun. If you are a young boy in this household, your labour awaits you. Perhaps you apprentice with a cooper, learning to bend wooden staves into barrels that will hold fish, molasses, rum. Perhaps you assist a printer, inking type that will press pamphlets filled with sermons, trade announcements, or sharp political commentary. If you are fortunate, your family can afford schooling beyond basic reading. Literacy in Great Britain's colonies is surprisingly high, driven largely by the religious demand that every person read scripture. If you are a girl, your path is narrower. Domestic training begins early. You learn to sew, to preserve food, to manage accounts in quiet support of a husband not yet chosen. You learn which herbs ease fever and which neighbours gossip too freely. And if you are enslaved, yes, in this northern port town, your day begins even earlier. You may not live in this cramped house by choice. You may belong to it. Your labour may be demanded, not negotiated. You may rise before the family does to haul water, chop wood, scrub floors, haul cargo at the docks. Your dreams, if you allow yourself to have them, are guarded carefully. Step outside now. The street is alive with motion. Women carry baskets toward the marketplace. A cart rattles over uneven ground, its wooden wheels grinding against stone and frozen mud. The smell hits you first. Manure, brine, smoke. Human bodies wrapped in wool that is rarely fully clean. Look toward the harbour. Masts pierce the sky like a forest of stripped trees. Ships rock gently against docks darkened by tar. Sailors shout in accents from London, Bristol, the Caribbean. Cargo is unloaded with methodical urgency. Barrels, crates, ropes, salted cod stacked in heavy piles. Boston's wealth breathes here. Trade routes connect this small colonial town to a vast Atlantic network. Timber from New England becomes masts for British ships. Fish becomes sustenance for enslaved labourers in the Caribbean sugar islands. Molasses flows back, thick and sweet, destined to be distilled into rum. Rum travels to West Africa, exchanged in human transactions too brutal to speak of lightly. You may not see the entire chain from where you stand, but you are inside it. Walk now toward the meeting house. It dominates the skyline not because of decorative extravagance, but because of authority. Religion here is not a Sunday accessory. It is the skeleton of society. Laws echo scripture. Public behaviour is measured against sermons delivered in stern cadence. On Sundays, attendance is compulsory. On weekdays, the minister's words still linger in the air like smoke. Concepts of sin, salvation, predestination. These are not abstract theology debates reserved for scholars. They shape how you view your neighbour, how you judge yourself, how you endure suffering. Inside the meeting house, wooden benches are hard and unadorned. There is no heat beyond what bodies generate. Sermons stretch long, sometimes 2 hours or more. You listen, not because entertainment is expected, but because eternal destiny is at stake. And yet, outside these walls, life hums with contradictions. Step into a tavern at midday. It is louder than the meeting house ever allows. Men lean over tables stained by ale rings. Political pamphlets circulate, some printed anonymously to avoid backlash. Discussions grow heated about taxes imposed by Parliament, about trade restrictions, about the morality of inoculating against smallpox. You hear the name of a controversial minister advocating a radical medical practice learned from an enslaved African man. You hear others call it blasphemous interference with God's will. Voices rise, fists pound tables. This is not yet revolution, but it is friction. Return home in the afternoon. Your mother scrubs laundry in a wooden tub. The water is cold, her hands red and raw. Soap is homemade, harsh against skin. She hums a hymn quietly, not necessarily out of joy, but out of rhythm, perhaps habit. Children chase one another briefly before chores resume. There is no extended childhood here. Play exists, but responsibility arrives early and stays. As dusk approaches, the light fades quickly. There are no street lamps. The world contracts. Families gather near the hearth again. Candles are expensive, so they are rationed carefully. Stories are told of storms survived, of relatives lost to illness, of opportunities whispered in the distance. You might hear talk of Harvard College, founded nearly a century earlier, educating young men for ministry and leadership. Its presence in nearby Cambridge feels both close and distant, a symbol of intellectual ambition in a town still defined by raw survival. When night fully claims the sky, darkness is complete. Listen carefully. The harbour creaks. A distant dog barks. The watchman calls out the hour, his voice echoing down narrow streets. Inside, the house settles with soft cracks as wood contracts in the cold. You lie down again, straw mattress rustling. Your body aches from labour, honest, repetitive, necessary. You think briefly about tomorrow. It will look much like today. But beneath the routine, something stirs. You feel it in the arguments at the tavern, in the whispered doubts after sermons, in the way merchants quietly calculate profits and question British restrictions, in the fear that smallpox might return with the next ship. Everyday life here is not static. It is building pressure. And as you drift towards sleep, wrapped in coarse wool beneath a roof that groans in the wind, you cannot know that historians centuries later will call this period pre-revolutionary. To you, it is simply life, demanding, structured, fragile, and about to be tested. We have been taught to imagine 1720s Boston as a moral fortress, a city of upright Puritans in black coats and white collars, a disciplined, God-fearing society building the foundations of American liberty brick by righteous brick. But that image is a carefully polished myth. The truth is more complicated and far more human. Boston in the 1720s was not a frozen portrait of piety. It was restless, divided, commercially aggressive, socially anxious, spiritually uncertain. Yes, religion saturated public life. Yes, church bells structured the week. But beneath the sermons, beneath the strict codes of conduct, a marketplace of ambition and contradiction thrived. Let's break the first illusion, that this was a purely religious colony uninterested in profit. Walk again to the harbour in your mind. Look closely at the ships docked along the wharves of Boston. Their hulls are not symbols of humble devotion. They are instruments of commerce, sharp-edged, calculating, global. Boston's merchants were not merely surviving, they were competing. They tracked commodity prices in London. They studied shipping routes. They invested in cargo that tied them to plantations in the Caribbean and trading posts along the African coast. This was capitalism in its muscular adolescence. Rum distilleries operated openly. Molasses flowed in heavy barrels from sugar islands, where enslaved labourers endured brutal conditions. That molasses became rum. Rum became currency in the transatlantic slave trade. The cycle turned with methodical efficiency, and Boston benefited. The wealth accumulated in counting houses along the waterfront did not smell like incense. It smelled like tar, salt, and profit. Second illusion, that the town was socially harmonious. It wasn't. Beneath the appearance of tight-knit community lay tension between rich and poor, merchant and labourer, minister and skeptic. Poverty existed here. Widows begged. Debt imprisoned men who failed in business. Servants laboured in households where hierarchy was rigidly enforced. Public punishment served as spectacle and warning. The stock stood ready for those accused of drunkenness or disorder. Gossip spread faster than ships. Reputation was currency, fragile and fiercely defended. Even within the church, disagreements simmered. The Puritan founding generation had envisioned a city upon a hill, a shining example of godly order. But by the 1720s, cracks showed. Younger generations questioned rigid doctrines. The emotional intensity of earlier decades had cooled into routine ritual for some, and that frightened religious leaders, because doubt was more dangerous than open rebellion. Now let's dismantle the third illusion, that early Boston was racially uniform and culturally simple. It wasn't. Enslaved Africans lived and worked here, in kitchens, on docks, in workshops. They were not distant figures confined to southern plantations. They were present in the daily rhythm of the town. Some were baptized into Christian congregations, yet remained legally owned. Some learned trades. Some resisted in small, quiet ways. Their stories rarely appeared in official records unless conflict erupted, but their labour shaped the economy. Indigenous peoples from surrounding regions moved through trade networks, sometimes selling goods, sometimes negotiating fragile peace arrangements. Their presence complicated the narrative of a purely English settlement. Boston in the 1720s was already entangled in a global web of culture, commerce, and coercion. And then there is the illusion of intellectual simplicity, that colonists were isolated from big ideas. In truth, Enlightenment thought drifted across the Atlantic like contraband wind. Philosophical debates about reason, science, and natural rights circulated in pamphlets and books imported from Great Britain. Print shops in Boston reprinted essays that questioned authority in subtle but potent ways. Consider the controversy over smallpox inoculation in 1721. When the epidemic struck, fear gripped the town. Death counts rose, houses were marked, families quarantined. Into this panic stepped a radical proposal: deliberately infect a healthy person with a controlled dose of smallpox to build immunity. The idea came not from European elites, but from knowledge carried by an enslaved African man who described the practice used in his homeland. A minister amplified the idea publicly. A physician implemented it. The backlash was explosive. Some called it divine interference, others called it salvation. A bomb was thrown through the minister's window with a note attached condemning the practice. Does this sound like a static, obedient society? Or does it sound like a community wrestling with science, race, faith, and fear all at once? Myth number 4, that everyday life was morally clearer then than now. It wasn't. People justified participation in exploitative trade while preaching spiritual purity. They enforced strict codes of female modesty while tolerating male excess behind tavern doors. They demanded obedience to the British Crown while quietly resenting parliamentary control over trade. Contradiction was not accidental, it was structural. And here is the deeper truth. The myth of tidy colonial virtue persists because it comforts us. It suggests origins were simple, that the moral blueprint was clean, that corruption came later. But the 1720s reveal something more unsettling and more honest. From the beginning, Boston was a place where ideals collided with incentives, where sermons thundered about humility while merchant ledgers calculated gain, where community meant both protection and surveillance, where liberty was spoken of passionately, yet unevenly distributed. This does not diminish the people who lived there. It makes them real. Imagine being a young apprentice printer, setting type late into the evening. You read every word you assemble, political essays, religious tracts, shipping news. You begin to notice patterns, the way authority is defended in some paragraphs and questioned in others. You see how language can stir emotion, can unify, can divide. Or imagine being a woman managing a household while your husband sails for months at a time. You control finances quietly, you negotiate with suppliers, you maintain social ties essential for survival. Your influence is unofficial but undeniable. Or imagine being enslaved, absorbing the contradictions of a society preaching Christian brotherhood while denying your autonomy. You listen, you remember, you wait. The myth of a monolithic Puritan Boston dissolves when you step into individual lives. It was not a town frozen in moral certainty. It was a living organism, reactive, adaptive, flawed. And perhaps the greatest myth of all is that history moves in straight lines. Standing in 1720s, Boston, revolution is not inevitable. Independence is not guaranteed. The future is murky. Allegiance to Britain still defines political identity for most. The word American does not yet carry revolutionary electricity. Daily life feels repetitive, constrained by weather, by harvest cycles, by trade seasons. Yet under that repetition, pressure builds. Doubt seeps in through pamphlets. Profit challenges piety. Disease challenges doctrine. Diversity challenges uniformity. The town does not know it is incubating transformation. It believes it is preserving tradition. And that is the fragile beauty of this moment. Because once you strip away the myth, once you see the 1720s not as a quaint prelude but as a tense negotiation between ideals and realities, the streets feel different, more electric, more unstable, more alive. The illusion of simplicity has been broken. Now we can begin to see the cost of living inside that complexity. Her name is Mercy. No statues will carry it. No chapter in a textbook will centre her. But she wakes every morning in 1727 in Boston with the same pounding heart as any governor or merchant prince. And her day is harder. Mercy is 29 years old. She has buried 2 children. The first died in winter before reaching his 2nd birthday, a fever that began as a cough and turned his small body into a furnace. The second never drew breath at all. The midwife said nothing could have been done. The minister said God's will is mysterious. Mercy said nothing. Her silence is not weakness, it is endurance. She rises before dawn because grief does not excuse chores. The hearth must be relit. The floor must be swept. Bread must be kneaded from coarse flour milled locally. She presses her fists into the dough with steady rhythm, the muscle memory of survival stronger than the ache in her chest. Outside her small window the harbour fog hangs low. Ships wait like dark silhouettes against the pale horizon. Somewhere beyond that water lies Great Britain, a place she will never see, but whose laws shape the price of the molasses she buys and the taxes her husband curses. Mercy does not debate politics in taverns. She feels politics in the market. When sugar costs more, she stretches recipes thinner. When cloth imports slow, she patches garments instead of replacing them. When rumours of trade restrictions spread, she listens not as an ideologue but as a mother calculating winter stores. Her husband, Samuel, is a cooper. He shapes barrels from oak staves, his hands permanently rough from labour. He speaks of opportunity, of expanding contracts, of shipping goods farther south. He believes Boston is growing, that prosperity is possible if they remain disciplined and faithful. Mercy believes in survival. The house they share is narrow, 2 rooms downstairs, sleeping loft above. Smoke stains the ceiling beams dark brown. The air carries a permanent scent of ash and boiled cabbage. There is no corner of this home untouched by labour. Yet inside these walls, Mercy feels both confined and fiercely protective. She scrubs linens in cold water drawn from a nearby pump, her knuckles splitting in winter frost. She tends a small garden patch behind the house, onions, herbs, perhaps a few carrots if the soil cooperates. She renders animal fat into tallow for candles. She mends stockings by firelight until her eyes blur. Her world is measured in tasks, but beneath the repetition runs a constant undercurrent of fear. Smallpox has not fully loosened its grip on Boston's memory. The epidemic of 1721 still lingers like a ghost. Mercy remembers the marked houses, doors painted to signal infection within. She remembers the smell of sickness, the way neighbours avoided one another in the street. She remembers watching a mother across the way carry out a child wrapped too tightly in cloth. When news circulates that another ship has docked with illness aboard, Mercy's pulse quickens. She wipes her hands on her apron and scans her remaining child, Abigail, now 5 years old, for any sign of a rash or fever. Abigail laughs easily. She chases chickens. She asks questions about everything. Mercy answers as best she can. Why does God take babies? There is no script for that. Why can't I go to school like the boys? Because the world was not designed with her education in mind. Why do we pray so much? Because in a town where death is ordinary, eternity feels urgent. On Sundays, Mercy dresses in her plainest respectable gown and walks to the meeting house. She sits upright for hours as the minister speaks of sin, repentance, divine order. She listens carefully, not out of blind obedience, but because her life has taught her how fragile control truly is. Religion offers structure where randomness reigns, but even faith has its tensions. When whispers of inoculation began during the last epidemic, the idea of deliberately introducing smallpox matter into a healthy person to create immunity, Mercy felt torn. Some called it a miracle of modern understanding. Others called it defiance of God's sovereignty. If another outbreak comes, would she risk Abigail's life on such a procedure? The question sits like a stone in her stomach. In the marketplace, Mercy navigates another kind of tension, hierarchy. She knows which women outrank her by wealth and family name. She knows how to lower her eyes respectfully while still asserting fair prices. She knows which households own enslaved people and which rent their labour quietly. Yes, slavery exists here, not hidden in distant plantations but woven into daily transactions. Mercy has seen black men hauling cargo at the docks, black women carrying bundles through narrow lanes. She has heard sermons justifying the system with scripture twisted into comfort. She does not own anyone. She tells herself that matters, but she benefits from the trade that sustains it. The molasses she buys cheaply, tied to sugar plantations in the Caribbean, the rum her husband sometimes drinks, part of a triangular exchange that trades human lives for profit. Mercy does not trace the entire map. Survival leaves little time for moral cartography. Yet sometimes, when she passes an enslaved woman in the street, and their eyes meet briefly, something unsettled flickers inside her. A recognition of shared labour under different chains. Afternoons bring exhaustion. Abigail naps briefly while Mercy repairs a tear in Samuel's work shirt. The needle moves in and out with practiced precision. Outside, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes down the lane. Somewhere, a dog barks at nothing. Life feels small and enormous at once. Small because her world rarely extends beyond these few streets. Enormous because every decision, to spend or save, to trust a rumour or dismiss it, to discipline a child harshly or gently, carries consequences in a town where reputation spreads faster than fire. At dusk, Samuel returns smelling of wood shavings and sweat. They eat together in near silence, conserving candlelight. Conversation drifts to neighbours. Who is expecting? Who is ill? Who is rumoured to be in debt? Debt is another quiet terror. A single failed contract could unravel their stability. Debtor's prison looms not as an abstract punishment, but as a real possibility. Mercy has seen families fractured by unpaid loans, wives left to beg relatives for assistance. So she counts coins carefully. She stretches supplies. She saves scraps of cloth that others might discard. At night, when Abigail sleeps, Mercy sometimes allows herself to feel the full weight of her buried children. She sits near the dying embers and lets tears fall silently, careful not to wake Samuel. Grief in 1720s. Boston is common. It is almost expected. But common does not mean easy. She presses her palm against her abdomen where life once grew and whispers a prayer not found in any formal liturgy. Let this one live. Outside, the harbour, wind rattles shutters. A ship's bell rings faintly in the distance. Somewhere in town, a tavern argument swells and then subsides. Mercy blows out the last candle. Darkness closes in completely. In that darkness, her life does not feel like a stepping stone toward revolution or historical significance. It feels immediate, physical, uncertain. She's not thinking about independence from Britain. She's thinking about winter stores, about illness, about Abigail's future in a world that limits her before she understands the word limitation. And yet, in households like Mercy's, in the quiet resilience of women who manage scarcity, who question sermons internally, who weigh new medical ideas against tradition, change incubates, not loudly, not heroically, but steadily. Everyday life in 1720s. Boston is not just mud streets and merchant ships. It is the private negotiations of mothers like Mercy. It is grief swallowed so children can be fed. It is faith clung to even when it confuses more than it comforts. History remembers governors, ministers, revolutionaries, but towns are built and transformed by women kneading dough before sunrise, by fathers sanding barrel edges smooth, by children asking inconvenient questions at the hearth. Mercy does not know it yet, but the world her daughter inherits will be shaped by pressures already tightening around them. Economic strain, religious debate, whispered dissatisfaction with distant authority. For now she sleeps lightly, because in Boston, safety is never guaranteed, and tomorrow will demand everything she has again. Now step back, pull away from Mercy's narrow staircase, from the smoke-stained ceiling beams, from the small garden patch fighting stubborn soil. Rise above the rooftops of Boston and look down at the entire town at once. What you see is not just hardship, You see energy. You see a place vibrating with ambition. Because here is the deeper truth that complicates everything we've felt so far. For many who lived here in the 1720s, Boston was not merely a crucible of survival. It was a land of opportunity, raw, imperfect, but alive with possibility. The same streets that smelled of manure and brine also smelled like progress. Merchants did not view themselves as villains in a global web of exploitation. They saw themselves as builders of prosperity. They invested in ships not simply for greed, but for legacy. A successful voyage meant expansion, a larger home, better apprenticeships for sons, dowries for daughters. Stand now inside a counting house near the docks. The room is narrow but orderly. Ledgers lie open on a heavy wooden desk. Quill pens scratch across parchment. Numbers dominate the page. Columns of profit, loss, tariffs, insurance costs. A map of the Atlantic hangs on the wall, routes traced in faded ink between Boston, Barbados, London and beyond. For the merchant here, this town is not fragile. It is ascending. He sees ships multiplying each year. He sees wharves extending farther into the harbour. He sees warehouses swelling with goods. He believes, sincerely, that this colony is proof of divine favour. And in his mind, discipline and profit are not opposites. They are partners. The Puritan ethic of hard work, thrift and moral vigilance feeds directly into commercial expansion. To prosper is not necessarily to sin. It may be evidence of God's blessing. That belief changes the emotional landscape, because now the strict sermons, the moral surveillance, the rigid codes, they are not merely oppressive, they are stabilizing forces in a rapidly expanding economy. Order is necessary when wealth grows quickly. Reputation protects investment. Trust oils the machinery of trade. Perspective matters. Walk next toward a print shop. The air smells of ink and damp paper. Wooden type blocks sit arranged in trays like silent alphabets waiting to speak. A young apprentice wipes sweat from his brow as he presses fresh sheets bearing essays, announcements, theological arguments. Literacy in Boston is remarkably high for its time. The town consumes words hungrily. Pamphlets circulate through taverns and meeting houses. Newspapers carry shipping news, editorials, advertisements for runaway servants. Information moves quickly here, and with it, ideas. This is not an intellectually stagnant village clinging blindly to old dogma. It is a town negotiating new currents, scientific thought, Enlightenment philosophy, political theory filtering in from Great Britain and continental Europe. When the smallpox inoculation debate erupted earlier in the decade, it revealed something extraordinary. Boston was capable of wrestling publicly with cutting-edge medical innovation. Fiercely, yes, violently even. But the debate itself signalled engagement with modernity. That bomb thrown through a minister's window? It was not the act of a society asleep. It was the convulsion of one grappling with change. Shift again. Imagine you are not Mercy, nor a merchant, nor an apprentice. Imagine you are an enslaved man named Kwame, forcibly transported years ago and now labouring along the docks. From your perspective, Boston is neither quaint nor ascending. It is a paradox. You hear colonists speak of liberty in abstract terms, of rights granted by God, of resistance to distant authority when taxes feel unjust. You listen while hauling barrels heavier than your own autonomy. You absorb English quickly because survival demands it. You observe contradictions more clearly than most. You know that opportunity here is selective. You watch ships depart and wonder if any horizon holds a different fate. The town's ambition does not include you, and yet, even within bondage, life contains layers. There are friendships among the enslaved. There are cultural memories preserved in song, in rhythm tapped quietly on crate edges. There are moments of resistance so subtle they pass unnoticed by owners, learning to read secretly, slowing labour by fractions, forming community in shadows. Boston's everyday life depends on these invisible currents. Now pivot once more. Consider the indigenous trader arriving from surrounding territories to exchange goods, furs, corn, information. His people have already endured decades of violent conflict and uneasy treaties. He navigates this colonial port with strategic caution. To him, Boston is not a beginning. It is an intrusion layered atop older histories. The streets that feel established to English settlers are recent impositions on land shaped by others, long before wooden houses rose here. Perspective fractures the myth of singular narrative. For some 1720s, Boston is a beacon of disciplined prosperity. For others, it is a site of exploitation. For many, it is simply home, flawed but familiar. And here lies the unexpected truth. Everyday life here contains genuine pride. Residents boast of their schools, of Harvard College across the river training ministers and leaders. They take satisfaction in self-governance within colonial structures. Town meetings allow male property owners to debate local issues directly. This participatory element feels empowering compared to rigid hierarchies in parts of Europe. There is a sense, faint but growing, that this community can shape its own destiny. Not independence yet, but autonomy within limits. Walk through the town meeting. Voices rise in debate over road repairs, taxation for public works, militia readiness. Men argue passionately. Votes are cast. Decisions made collectively. For those allowed to participate, this feels revolutionary in its own way. But notice who stands outside. Women like Mercy, enslaved men like Kwame, servants without property, indigenous traders passing through. Democracy here is partial, conditional, and yet it plants seeds. Because once a portion of the population experiences even limited self-rule, the appetite for more grows quietly. The perspective shift reveals something vital. 1720s. Boston is not simply enduring pressure, it is generating momentum. Its economy expands, its population grows, its literacy spreads ideas faster than ever before, its moral codes strain under commercial ambition, its residents debate science and theology with intensity. The town is alive with friction, and friction produces heat. Stand again at the harbour at sunset. The sky burns orange over clustered masts. Water slaps against hulls. Workers finish unloading cargo as gulls circle overhead. The smell of salt and tar mixes with wood smoke drifting from hundreds of hearths. This is not a sleepy colonial backwater. It is a node in a global system. And systems carry consequences, because as wealth accumulates, so does scrutiny from Britain. As autonomy strengthens locally, imperial oversight tightens. As ideas circulate about rights and reason, expectations shift. Boston does not yet realize it is rehearsing for future confrontation, but the rehearsal is happening daily, in counting houses balancing books under imperial trade laws, in taverns debating taxes, in meeting houses arguing science and salvation, in households stretching resources under fluctuating import costs. Perspective reshapes everything. Mercy's grief exists within a town also fueled by ambition. Kwame's bondage exists within rhetoric of liberty. The merchant's optimism exists alongside systemic exploitation. Everyday life in 1720s, Boston is not one story. It is a collision of stories moving in the same confined space. And collisions build force. The harbour darkens. Lanterns flicker along wharves. A ship creaks as tide shifts beneath it. From above, the town looks almost peaceful. But beneath that appearance, Tensions align like storm fronts gathering over open water. The next disruption will not come gently. It never does in places already vibrating with contradiction. The disruption does not arrive with cannons. It arrives with a whisper that becomes a rumour that becomes a knock at your neighbour's door. A fever has returned. In the late summer heat of 1721, and echoing into the uneasy years that follow, smallpox does not storm into Boston like a dramatic invader. It seeps in quietly aboard a ship from the Caribbean. A sailor disembarks with symptoms half hidden beneath sweat and fatigue. Within days, pustules bloom. Within weeks, the town feels its pulse quicken. The memory of past outbreaks is still fresh. Too fresh. At first, officials attempt containment. The infected are isolated. Houses are marked. Families are warned to remain indoors. But Boston is compact, intimate, crowded. Separation is more theory than reality. Servants move between homes. Dock workers gather at taverns. Children chase one another through narrow lanes. Fear spreads faster than the disease. Mercy hears the news in the marketplace before she sees proof. A woman leans close, voice low, eyes wide. It's begun again. By evening, the rumour hardens into fact. A second household reports illness, then a third. Church bells toll, not for worship but for death. The psychological temperature of the town shifts instantly. Conversations shorten, laughter thins, every cough becomes suspicious, every flushed cheek sends mothers into spirals of dread. And then the plot twist. The fracture that splits Boston not just medically, but morally. A minister stands before his congregation and proposes something radical: inoculation. He has learned of a practice from an enslaved African man who described how, in his homeland, smallpox matter was deliberately introduced into a healthy person's skin to create immunity. The procedure carries risk, yes, but far less than the full-blown disease. A local physician agrees to try it. Suddenly, the enemy is no longer just the virus. It is each other. Pamphlets appear almost overnight. Some praise the procedure as enlightened, progressive, life-saving. Others condemn it as reckless tampering with divine will. Is it faith to accept disease as God's judgment, or faith to use knowledge to fight it? Taverns erupt into argument. Men pound tables, faces flushed with ale and conviction. We are not meant to play God, one insists. Better a natural death than a man-made one. Across the room, another fires back. If God gives us reason and understanding, are we not meant to use them? The debate is not polite, it is personal, because inoculation requires choice, and choice divides neighbours. Imagine Mercy and Samuel at their table late at night. Abigail sleeps upstairs, unaware that her parents are debating her future. If she catches it naturally, Samuel begins, not finishing the sentence. If she dies because we interfered, Mercy replies, her voice barely steady. Outside, the watchman calls the hour. Inside, a family weighs science against salvation. This is escalation, not just of disease, but of ideology. Numbers climb, hundreds fall ill, dozens die. Some who undergo inoculation recover with milder symptoms, their survival cited as proof. Others suffer complications, fueling outrage. A crude explosive device is hurled through the minister's window one night, with a note attached condemning him as a murderer. Violence now accompanies debate. The town's earlier friction between tradition and modernity, between authority and autonomy, ignites under the pressure of mortality. Print shops work relentlessly, producing essays that accuse, defend, mock, plead. Boston becomes a battleground of ink and infection. And here is the deeper twist. The epidemic exposes existing fault lines in class and race. Inoculation costs money. Not everyone can afford it, The wealthy are more likely to access controlled treatment. The poor face higher exposure in crowded quarters. Enslaved individuals may be inoculated at the discretion of owners, not out of humanitarian concern alone, but to protect investment. Disease does not discriminate biologically, but society does. Walk again through the streets. The air smells sharper now. Vinegar used as crude disinfectant. Herbs burned in desperate attempts to purify space. Windows remain shuttered. Red flags mark infected houses. Funeral processions pass more frequently, solemn and restrained. Children disappear from public view. Commerce slows. Ships hesitate before docking. Trade contracts wobble under uncertainty. The merchant who once saw only growth now calculates loss. The illusion of steady ascent fractures. In meeting houses, sermons intensify. Some ministers frame the outbreak as divine correction, a reminder of moral drift. Others emphasize compassion and practical response. Congregations thin as fear overrides obligation, and beneath it all, a new kind of consciousness stirs. Boston realizes it is vulnerable, not only to disease, but to internal division. Before the epidemic, tension simmered under debates about trade laws and theology. Now, neighbors accuse neighbors of endangering children. Families choose sides. The word inoculator becomes either badge of courage or mark of recklessness, depending on who speaks it. The psychological landscape hardens. Kwame, labouring near the docks, watches this turmoil with complex awareness. He sees white colonists arguing passionately about bodily autonomy, while his own remains unrecognised. He observes ministers quoting scripture to defend or oppose inoculation, while slavery itself remains scripturally justified in the same breath. Contradictions sharpen under crisis. Meanwhile, Mercy cannot escape the sound of Abigail's breathing at night. Every slight wheeze tightens her chest. She washes her daughter's hands obsessively. She avoids certain streets. She listens for news each morning like one awaiting a verdict. Escalation reaches a fever pitch when death statistics begin circulating in print. Columns of names, ages, neighbourhoods. Numbers transform fear into measurable reality. And something else begins to shift quietly beneath the chaos. Trust in authority fractures. If ministers disagree publicly, which voice carries divine truth? If physicians argue over science, who holds knowledge? If town officials cannot prevent the spread, how absolute is their control? A seed of skepticism takes root. Not rebellion yet, but doubt. The epidemic eventually subsides, as all waves do, leaving behind scars visible and invisible. Some households emerge intact. Others carry absence like a permanent shadow. The inoculation debate does not end cleanly. It leaves residue, resentment, vindication, unresolved tension. But Boston is no longer the same town it was before the fever arrived. It has tasted modern scientific controversy. It has witnessed violence sparked by ideological divide. It has confronted the limits of prayer alone. Most importantly, it has learned that consensus is fragile. The harbour resumes its rhythm gradually. Ships dock. Trade restarts. Taverns fill again with cautious laughter. But something intangible lingers in the air, a realization that stability can evaporate quickly. Escalation has changed the town's nervous system. People look at one another differently now. When the next argument arises, about taxes, about British interference, about rights, it will not emerge in a naive community. It will erupt in one already seasoned by internal fracture. Because crisis teaches a dangerous lesson. Authority can be questioned, and once that door opens, it rarely closes quietly. Boston breathes again, but it breathes differently. If you want to understand what everyday life was really like in 1720s Boston, You have to look beneath the visible drama, beneath the sermons, the ships, the smallpox scars. You have to see the machinery, because Boston was not just a town of individuals navigating hardship, it was a system. And like any system, it ran on mechanisms most people rarely named out loud. The first mechanism was trade law. Every barrel Samuel shaped, every crate unloaded at the docks, every spoonful of molasses Mercy stretched into a recipe, all of it was entangled in regulations written an ocean away in Great Britain. The Navigation Act dictated which ships could carry colonial goods, where those goods could be sold, which ports were legal. On paper, these laws were about imperial efficiency, keeping wealth inside the British system. In practice, they were pressure points. Boston merchants learned to navigate them with creativity. Some complied strictly. Others smuggled quietly, slipping goods past customs officials who might be persuaded to look the other way. Rum travelled in shadows as often as it did in official manifests. Molasses from non-British islands found its way into Boston distilleries despite restrictions. Smuggling was not always seen as criminal, it was seen as practical. Here is the hidden layer, everyday morality bent under economic necessity. A merchant could attend church faithfully in the morning and evade trade law in the afternoon without perceiving contradiction. Survival and profit justified flexibility. And when enough people participate in quiet rule-bending, enforcement weakens. The second mechanism was credit. Coin was scarce in the colonies. Hard currency flowed back to Britain. So Boston operated on trust and paper, I owe us, promissory notes, extended credit between merchants and customers. Mercy might purchase fabric on account, promising payment after Samuel completed his next contract. A shopkeeper extended that trust because reputation served as collateral. If Samuel failed to pay, word would spread. Doors would close, credit would vanish. This system bound the community together in invisible threads. Trust was currency, which meant reputation was survival, public shaming, gossip, church discipline. These weren't merely moral tools, they were economic safeguards. A dishonest man threatened not just virtue but financial stability. The third mechanism was hierarchy enforced through intimacy. Boston was small enough that everyone watched everyone else. Ministers knew parishioners personally, merchants recognized dock workers by name. Women exchanged news at wells and markets. Surveillance was communal. You did not need a formal police force when neighbours reported irregular behaviour. If someone skipped church too often, drank excessively, failed to pay debts, or challenged authority too loudly, the town responded collectively, through social isolation, legal penalties, whispered warnings. This created a paradox. Community offered protection, but it also limited deviation. Now add another hidden mechanism, fear of external threat. Memories of earlier wars with indigenous nations lingered. Tensions between European empires, Britain, France, Spain, cast long shadows across colonial life. Boston's militia trained not just as ritual, but in anticipation of possible conflict. Muskets were not decorative heirlooms, they were tools maintained carefully. That constant readiness shaped psychology. When you believe threat may arrive from sea or forest, unity feels essential. Dissent can be framed as weakness. Authority gains weight. But here's where the mechanism turns quietly against itself. As Boston grew economically confident, reliance on Britain began to feel less protective and more restrictive. Merchants saw their own capacity. They built ships locally. They financed voyages. They generated wealth. And yet imperial policy reminded them who ultimately controlled the system. This tension remained mostly unspoken in the 1720s, but it hummed beneath transactions. Consider a scene inside a warehouse near the docks, Two merchants speak in low tones while reviewing shipping documents. Parliament tightens the rules again, one mutters. They need our timber, the other replies. They won't choke the supply. They don't live here. That final sentence carries more weight than it appears. Distance breeds misunderstanding. The hidden mechanism of empire depends on acceptance of authority from afar. But everyday life in Boston was immediate, tactile. The mud on boots, the smell of fish, the calculation of credit. When imperial decisions disrupted that immediacy, resentment seeded quietly. Now examine another layer, gendered power. Women like Mercy operated households that functioned as economic units. They produced goods, managed accounts, negotiated purchases. Yet legally their identity was often subsumed under their husbands. This imbalance was normalized. But normalization does not eliminate awareness. Within kitchens and bedchambers, conversations unfolded that never reached official minutes. Women discussed rising prices, questioned sermons privately, evaluated medical risks pragmatically. Their influence flowed beneath formal authority like groundwater shaping stone over time. Invisible does not mean powerless. And then there is race, the most concealed mechanism of all. Enslaved Africans in Boston were not just labourers. They were knowledge carriers. The inoculation practice that ignited debate came from an enslaved man's experience. African maritime workers brought skills from across the Atlantic. Cultural memory survived in music, speech patterns, spiritual practices adapted under watchful eyes. Yet the legal system defined them as property. The town's prosperity leaned on their labour while denying their autonomy. This contradiction required psychological compartmentalization. Colonists reconciled Christian doctrine with slavery through selective interpretation. They convinced themselves hierarchy was divinely ordained. Systems survive by telling stories about themselves. Boston told itself it was orderly, godly, industrious. It downplayed the violence embedded in its trade networks. It framed smuggling as necessity rather than rebellion. It treated women's labour as duty rather than leadership. These narratives lubricated the machinery. But crises, like the smallpox epidemic, exposed cracks in those stories. When inoculation proved effective for some, it forced acknowledgement that knowledge could come from unexpected sources. When trade laws tightened, it revealed imperial control more starkly. When debt imprisoned neighbours, it highlighted fragility beneath prosperity. The hidden mechanisms began to show their gears, and once you see gears turning, you start asking who built them. Walk again through the town at dusk. Lantern light flickers against wooden facades. The meeting house casts a long shadow. From a distance, the town appears cohesive, a neat cluster of industry and devotion. Up close, it is layered with negotiations. Samuel shapes barrels, knowing they may carry goods smuggled past British oversight. Mercy buys molasses tied to Caribbean plantations she will never see. A merchant attends church while calculating how to circumvent tariffs. A minister preaches obedience to authority while quietly resenting interference from London bishops. Everyone participates in the system. Few control it fully. And here lies the most unsettling mechanism of all, normalization of tension. When friction becomes routine, people adapt rather than revolt. They grumble, adjust, innovate around constraints. They survive. But adaptation has limits. If pressure increases beyond a certain threshold, systems do not bend, they snap. In the 1720s, Boston has not snapped, yet. But the hidden layers are primed. Trade law, credit dependency, communal surveillance, imperial distance, racial hierarchy, gendered power, all interlocking gears grinding daily. Most residents wake thinking about chores, contracts, sermons, sickness. They do not wake thinking about structural mechanisms, and that is precisely how systems maintain themselves, until something forces everyone to see the machinery at once. And when that day comes, the sound will not be subtle. It will echo across the harbour. When fear settles into routine, survival becomes strategy. Boston does not collapse under pressure. It adapts. After the fever recedes and the pamphlets thin, everyday life in Boston does not return to innocence. It returns to calculation. People begin adjusting, not loudly, not collectively, but in small, deliberate ways that signal something deeper than obedience. Mercy changes first in ways no one notices. She begins storing more dried beans than usual. She trades for extra salt when prices dip. She keeps a mental ledger not only of coins, but of favours owed and granted. Survival, she realises, is not about reacting to crisis. It is about anticipating it. She also does something subtler. She listens more critically. When the minister speaks now, she does not absorb every word as unquestioned truth. She measures it against memory, against the chaos of the epidemic, against the way neighbours turned on one another over inoculation. Faith remains, but it is no longer blind. It is negotiated. That negotiation is a quiet form of resistance. Across town, Samuel the Cooper adjusts too. Trade disruptions during the outbreak taught him the fragility of depending entirely on British imports and shipping cycles. He experiments with sourcing more materials locally. He speaks with other craftsmen about forming informal agreements, sharing tools, extending credit carefully among trusted peers rather than distant merchants. These are not revolutionary acts, but they are incremental shifts away from dependence. At the docks, Kwame observes changes with sharper awareness than most. He has survived disease, survived transport across the Atlantic, survived a system designed to erase autonomy. Survival, for him, has always required strategy. He learns which overseers are predictable and which are volatile. He memorizes schedules. He builds quiet alliances among other enslaved men. They exchange information in fragments. Which households are sympathetic? Which ships might carry news from the Caribbean? Which sailors can be trusted with small requests? Resistance here is rarely dramatic. It is endurance with intention. In the taverns, arguments about inoculation gradually morph into broader conversations about authority. If ministers could disagree publicly about medical intervention, perhaps other forms of authority are not infallible either. A merchant voices frustration about new trade enforcement measures from Great Britain. "They tax us," he mutters into his mug, "yet they do not see our streets, our losses, our labour." A printer nods thoughtfully. Words like representation, rights, fairness begin surfacing more frequently, not shouted as slogans but tested in conversation. Survival evolves into ideological resistance slowly, almost imperceptibly. Meanwhile, the town's physical environment demands constant resilience. Winters in the 1720s are brutal. Snow buries narrow lanes, harbour water ices at the edges, firewood must be rationed. Frost creeps along window interiors like delicate deadly lace. Families crowd closer to hearths. Illness still prowls. Food stores shrink by February. Children grow thin by March. Yet spring always returns. With it, ships reappear on the horizon, sails billowing with renewed promise. Trade resumes. The market buzzes again. Laughter grows louder, cautious at first, then freer. Boston's survival instinct is cyclical. Crisis, adjustment, recovery, quiet recalibration. But beneath these cycles, something else intensifies, a growing awareness of collective vulnerability. During the epidemic, wealthy and poor alike faced infection. While outcomes differed, fear united them temporarily. That shared fear leaves a psychological imprint. It reminds the town that despite hierarchy, some threats ignore status. This realization fosters new forms of community cooperation, neighborhood watch groups during outbreaks, shared food during harsh winters, informal support networks for widows and debtors. Mutual aid becomes another quiet resistance, not against Britain directly, but against chaos itself. In town meetings, debates grow sharper. Property-owning men argue over militia funding, infrastructure improvements, taxation, fairness. They're no longer content to simply implement directives from afar without discussion. The experience of surviving disease by making controversial local decisions, like inoculation, has emboldened them. If they can choose medical intervention against opposition, perhaps they can question trade restrictions too. Even language begins to shift. Pamphlets adopt a slightly different tone, more assertive, less deferential. Writers experiment with satire aimed at imperial policies. Readers consume these words hungrily. Survival has sharpened intellect. For Mercy, survival also transforms motherhood. She encourages Abigail to ask questions, even when answers are uncomfortable. She teaches her to read not only scripture but notices posted in the square. Knowledge, Mercy senses instinctively, is a form of protection. This is subtle rebellion in a world where girls are expected to prepare only for domestic roles. Kwame's resistance takes another form. He learns to read numbers by observing cargo tallies. He memorizes port names from overheard conversations. Information becomes currency in his mind. Even without formal power, he gathers fragments of understanding about shipping routes, about enforcement schedules, about vulnerabilities in the system. Resistance here is mental. Boston itself resists in physical ways too. Smuggling increases quietly. When imperial trade laws restrict certain goods, merchants find alternate routes. Barrels are mislabeled, cargo manifests adjusted, harbour nights grow busier with discreet exchanges. The Crown may claim authority, but enforcement from across an ocean is imperfect. Every successful act of circumvention strengthens local confidence. The town begins to recognize its leverage. It is not yet rebellion, but it is rehearsal. Survival under pressure has taught Boston something critical. Centralized control has limits. Local knowledge, local networks, local decisions often prove more effective in crisis than distant mandates. And that realization plants a seed far more potent than any pamphlet. Even the church reflects this shift. While sermons remain stern, some ministers adopt more compassionate tones after witnessing epidemic devastation. They speak less of wrath, more of stewardship, of using reason and community to protect life. Not all agree, but the theological rigidity of earlier generations softens at the edges. Change here is not explosive, it is cumulative. One household storing extra grain, one craftsman diversifying supply, one enslaved man gathering knowledge, one merchant skirting a regulation, one mother teaching her daughter to read beyond expectation. These actions, layered together, create a culture of adaptive resistance. The streets of Boston in the late 1720s look much as they did before. Mud in rain, dust in summer, masts along the harbour, church steeples piercing grey skies. But internally, the town is harder, more sceptical, more self-reliant. Survival has strengthened its spine, and as new imperial policies loom on the horizon, as trade tensions tighten and parliamentary oversight grows more assertive, Boston is no longer a naive outpost grateful for distant protection. It is a community that has survived disease, internal division, economic disruption. It has learned to argue, it has learned to adapt, it has learned quietly to resist. The next challenge will not find it untested, because everyday life here has already been war by other means, against cold, against hunger, against infection, against doubt. And a town that survives long enough under pressure begins to ask a dangerous question. If we can endure this on our own, what else might we endure? Step out of the mud streets of 1720s Boston and look into a mirror, not a polished colonial tin reflection, but a modern one. What feels distant at first begins to look uncomfortably familiar. A contagious disease divides the public. Authorities disagree. Clergy and intellectuals argue over science versus faith. Pamphlets, the social media of their time, circulate competing narratives, some grounded in evidence, others in fear. Neighbours judge neighbours for their choices. Does this sound archaic? Or does it echo something we have lived through? The smallpox inoculation crisis of the 1720s was not merely a medical episode. It was a psychological stress test. It revealed how fragile consensus becomes under threat. It exposed how quickly information can polarize a community. It demonstrated that fear reshapes morality. And it forced ordinary people to decide whom to trust. Boston's residents did not have algorithms amplifying outrage. They had taverns and print shops. They did not scroll headlines. They unfolded broadsheets still smelling of ink. But the emotional mechanics were eerily similar. Uncertainty breeds speculation. Speculation breeds division. Division breeds identity. Once someone declared themselves pro-inoculation or anti-inoculation, the stance became part of who they were. Social circles adjusted, marriages strained, friendships cooled. Sound familiar? Now widen the mirror. Consider trade tensions in the 1720s. Merchants frustrated by regulations from Great Britain felt economically constrained by leaders who did not understand their daily reality. They argued that distant policymakers failed to grasp the lived consequences of tariffs and restrictions. How often, in modern times, do communities feel governed by institutions physically and emotionally removed from them? The language changes, the centuries shift, the emotion does not. Mercy's anxiety about rising food prices, about the fragility of credit, about illness threatening her child, these are not relics of a primitive past. They are human constants. Kwame's experience, living inside a society that speaks of liberty while denying it to him, is not merely colonial contradiction. It is a recurring tension in human history. Ideals proclaimed, access restricted. The modern mirror reveals an uncomfortable truth. We are not as different from 1720s Boston as we might like to believe. Look at the structure of everyday life then and now. They woke to uncertainty about disease. We woke to breaking news alerts. They argued in taverns over imperial overreach. We argue online over federal policy. They depended on global trade networks they barely saw but deeply felt. We depend on supply chains stretching across continents, disrupted by storms, politics, pandemics. They faced misinformation through anonymous pamphlets. We face misinformation at digital speed. The technology evolved, the psychology remained, but the mirror cuts deeper than surface parallels. Boston in the 1720s was a society wrestling with identity. Were they primarily loyal British subjects, or something distinct forming in the Atlantic world? They did not yet call themselves Americans with revolutionary certainty. They inhabited an in-between space, culturally British, geographically separate, increasingly self-reliant. Modern societies too often inhabit in-between spaces, between tradition and innovation, between national identity and global interdependence. That tension generates anxiety. It also generates transformation. Return for a moment to the image of Samuel discussing trade restrictions in a tavern. He does not speak of independence. That idea is still radical, even dangerous. But he feels friction. He senses imbalance between contribution and control. Many modern citizens express similar friction, contributing labour, taxes, participation, yet feeling unheard by decision-makers. The mirror does not flatten history, it sharpens it. Even the communal surveillance of 1720s Boston, neighbours monitoring attendance, morality, debt repayment, finds echo in our age of digital visibility. Reputation then spread through gossip. Today it spreads through posts and shares. Social consequence remains powerful. The difference lies in scale, not principle. But here is where the mirror becomes more unsettling. Boston survived crisis by adapting locally. They debated fiercely but remained physically present with one another. They could not retreat into entirely separate realities. They shared the same streets, the same wells, the same air. Conflict had to resolve, or at least stabilize, because avoidance was impossible. In the modern world, fragmentation can become more permanent. Communities split into parallel narratives sustained by different information streams. The 1720s show us both the danger and necessity of shared reality. Consider the inoculation debate again. Despite violence and outrage, data eventually emerged. Those inoculated died at significantly lower rates. Evidence accumulated. Over time, the practice gained broader acceptance. It was messy, painful, divisive, but it evolved. The lesson is not that history always bends toward reason effortlessly. It is that collective survival sometimes forces recalibration. The harbour of Boston in the 1720s symbolized interdependence. No household was truly isolated from global currents. Today's harbours are digital and economic, less visible but equally binding. When a storm hits across an ocean, supply chains tremble. When policy shifts in one nation, markets ripple elsewhere. Boston's residents may not have fully grasped the triangular trade's global complexity, but they felt its consequences in price fluctuations and cargo shortages. We too feel consequences of systems we rarely see in full. The mirror invites humility. It reminds us that future generations may look back at our era with similar astonishment, at how we argued, how we justified contradictions, how we navigated fear. Just as we examine Boston's blend of faith and profit, liberty and slavery, local pride and imperial constraint, someone may one day examine our own era's paradoxes. Mercy could not foresee a revolution. Samuel could not imagine independence. Kwame could not yet see emancipation. They lived in the tension of their present. So do we. The streets of 1720s Boston were narrower, the buildings wooden, the night darker, but the emotional architecture, fear, hope, division, resilience, stands startlingly intact across centuries. The modern mirror does not collapse history into sameness. It reveals continuity, and continuity carries a warning. The pressures shaping everyday life rarely announce themselves as historic in the moment. They feel immediate, frustrating, personal. Only in hindsight do they crystallize into turning points. Boston in the 1720s was not consciously marching toward revolution. It was navigating disease, trade disputes, moral debate, survival, just as we navigate ours. The question the mirror asks is simple and uncomfortable. What are we rehearsing right now without realizing it? Because if everyday life in 1720s Boston was a prelude disguised as routine, then perhaps our own routines are shaping futures we cannot yet see. And like them, we may only understand it once the harbour wind has already shifted. By the end of the 1720s, Boston is no longer merely adapting. It is arguing with itself, not in whispers now, but in structured, sustained confrontation over what kind of society it intends to become. The great debate is not officially declared, There is no banner announcing it in the streets of Boston, but you can feel it in the tension between sermons and shipping manifests, between town meetings and private dinner conversations. The question beneath all others is this: who holds authority here? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. The colony belongs to Great Britain. The Crown appoints governors. Parliament writes trade laws. The Church, though Puritan in local flavour, remains influenced by broader Protestant currents across the Atlantic. But everyday life has complicated that simplicity. The inoculation crisis proved that local ministers and physicians could defy popular opinion and survive. Merchants learned they could manoeuvre around imperial trade restrictions with relative impunity. Town meetings demonstrated that collective local decision-making carried real power. Authority, once assumed vertical and distant, begins to feel negotiable. Step inside a crowded town meeting hall. Candles flicker against rough wooden walls. The air is thick with breath and wool. Property-owning men stand to voice concerns about militia funding, about harbour improvements, about tax assessments. But beneath these practical matters runs a deeper current. A merchant rises. We bear the burden of imperial wars, he argues. Our ships supply timber, our men serve in militia, our trade enriches the empire. Yet new restrictions arrive without consultation. Is that justice? Murmurs ripple. Another man counters, we are subjects of the crown. Order requires obedience. To question Parliament is to risk chaos. There it is. Order versus autonomy. Security versus self-determination. These debates do not yet demand independence. They demand respect. But respect is a volatile currency. In taverns later that evening, the conversation sharpens. Without the formal constraints of the meeting house, language grows bolder. They sit in London and legislate lives they've never lived, one man says. And who are we? Another replies. To presume we know better than the empire that protects us. Protection. That word carries weight. British naval power guards Atlantic trade routes from rival European empires. Military alliances shield the colonies from French expansion in North America. Many Bostonians understand the benefits of imperial connection. But benefits feel abstract when taxes rise and regulations tighten. The debate becomes less about loyalty and more about balance. How much control should distant authority exert over local livelihood? Meanwhile, inside meeting houses, a parallel debate unfolds, theological but deeply political in implication. Some ministers cling to strict orthodoxy, emphasizing submission to divine and earthly hierarchy. Others adopt more progressive tones, influenced subtly by Enlightenment thought emphasizing reason and individual conscience. Congregants notice the difference. When a minister suggests that human reason is a gift to be exercised responsibly, it resonates beyond doctrine. It hints at civic reasoning too, at the idea that communities might govern themselves thoughtfully rather than simply obey. Ideas travel quietly. In print shops, pamphleteers push boundaries carefully. They avoid overt sedition but experiment with satire and coded critique. An essay might question the fairness of certain trade laws without naming Parliament directly. Another might praise the spirit of liberty in abstract terms. Readers understand subtext. The great debate is not merely political or religious, it is psychological. Boston is wrestling with identity. Are they primarily British subjects living abroad, or are they something new emerging in the Atlantic world? Most residents would reject the notion of severing ties completely. The idea feels reckless, even treasonous. But they also sense that their daily reality diverges increasingly from decisions made across the ocean. This cognitive dissonance creates emotional strain. Mercy feels it indirectly. When prices fluctuate due to imperial policy, when Samuel grumbles about customs enforcement, When sermons emphasize obedience in tones that feel defensive rather than confident, she senses tension without naming it political theory. Her world is domestic, but domestic life is where policy lands. Kwame perceives the debate through another lens. He hears colonists speak passionately about rights and representation. He observes their frustration at being governed from afar, yet he remains governed in every detail of his own existence, without representation at any level. The contradiction sharpens his awareness. Liberty, he realizes, is discussed selectively. This selective liberty becomes part of the great debate's unspoken layer. Boston's economy continues expanding, but prosperity does not distribute evenly. Wealth accumulates among merchant elites while labourers and servants navigate narrower margins. Class tension simmers beneath patriotic rhetoric. A dock worker might resent both imperial tariffs and merchant profits. The debate multiplies into factions, not two clean sides, but many intersecting grievances. And hovering above all is memory of disease, memory of internal division during the inoculation crisis. The town knows how quickly disagreement can escalate into violence. A bomb thrown through a minister's window is not easily forgotten. That memory tempers the debate, for now. Voices grow louder, but most still stop short of outright rebellion. Yet something irreversible has occurred. Authority has been examined publicly. Once examined, it cannot return to unquestioned status. The harbour remains busy. Ships still arrive and depart under British flags. Town criers still announce news from London. The King's portrait still hangs in official buildings. On the surface, nothing revolutionary has happened. But internally, Boston has shifted from passive colony to argumentative community. The great debate is not resolved in the 1720s, it deepens. Every new regulation from Britain adds weight to one side of the scale. Every reminder of imperial protection adds weight to the other. Residents wake each morning still concerned primarily with bread, barrels, illness, survival. Yet beneath those concerns, identity is fermenting. In a small port town smelling of salt and smoke, men argue about representation without yet realizing they are drafting the emotional blueprint of revolution. Women manage households affected by imperial policy without formal political voice, yet their daily calculations influence the tone of dinner-table conversations. Enslaved individuals observe liberty's rhetoric spreading unevenly, storing knowledge that will matter in future generations. The great debate is not a single confrontation. It is a sustained hum of questioning, and like the tide in Boston Harbour, it moves quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look up and realize the shoreline has changed. The 1720s do not end with independence. They end with awareness. Awareness that authority can be contested. Awareness that community can survive division. Awareness that identity is not fixed but forming. And once a town becomes aware of its own potential power, the future becomes far less predictable. The 1720s end without fireworks. No declarations are signed, no chains are visibly broken, no empire collapses, and yet something irreversible has taken root in Boston. The long-term consequences of everyday life in this decade are not dramatic in the moment. They are structural, psychological, cultural. The kind of consequences that do not explode. They accumulate. A generation that learned to survive disease, debate authority, navigate global trade, and manage moral contradictions will not return easily to quiet obedience. The first consequence is subtle but foundational: normalization of dissent. Before the inoculation crisis, disagreement with religious or civic leadership often felt dangerous, even sinful. After it, protest has precedent. Ministers have been publicly challenged and survived. Physicians have defied mobs and continued practicing. Citizens have shouted at one another in the streets, and the town did not collapse. The psychological boundary moved. That movement matters more than any single argument won or lost. By the early 1730s, a younger generation is coming of age. Boys who watch their fathers argue in taverns, girls who listened through doorways as mothers calculated how new trade restrictions would affect household budgets, enslaved children who observed liberty discussed with selective application. They inherit not just a port city but a culture of scrutiny. The second consequence is economic identity. Boston in the 1720s solidified its role as an Atlantic node, not a remote outpost but a connector between continents. Ships linked New England timber to Caribbean sugar to European markets, European goods back to colonial docks. This network binds Boston to the wider British Empire. It also teaches residents something profound. Their survival depends on global currents, not merely local soil. Dependence breeds awareness. When Parliament later tightens trade regulations, Bostonians will feel not abstract policy shifts, but immediate pressure on livelihoods. The emotional groundwork for resistance is already laid because economic interdependence was already felt in the 1720s. The third consequence lies in governance. Town meetings in this era did more than settle minor disputes. They trained ordinary property-owning men in procedural debate. They learned to draft resolutions, tally votes, argue amendments. They learned that governance is a skill, not divine magic. This practical political education cannot be undone. When larger imperial conflicts escalate decades later, Boston will not need to invent civic organization from scratch. It will draw on habits refined in earlier decades. But consequences are not evenly distributed. For the enslaved population, the 1720s harden a different trajectory. Atlantic trade expands. Wealth grows. With wealth comes increased demand for labor. Slavery in New England never mirrors plantation systems of the Caribbean in scale, but it embeds itself deeply in domestic and maritime life. The contradiction intensifies. A society debating representation while owning human beings. This contradiction does not vanish. It compounds. In kitchens and docks and workshops, enslaved individuals observe white colonists developing rhetoric about rights. That rhetoric will one day echo back in ways few in the 1720s anticipate. For women like Mercy, the decade also leaves imprint. She does not gain voting rights. She does not sit in town meetings. Yet she has managed household economies under strain, navigated epidemics, absorbed political tension indirectly. She understands survival as negotiation. When future boycotts of British goods arise, it will be women who enforce them within households. The domestic sphere becomes political terrain. The 1720s quietly prepared that transformation. Another long-term consequence is religious evolution. The rigid orthodoxy of earlier Puritan generations begins to loosen at the edges. Exposure to Enlightenment thought, scientific experimentation like inoculation, and economic diversification all dilute singular authority. This does not produce immediate secularism. It produces plurality. In coming decades, revivalist movements will sweep through New England, challenging established ministers and emphasizing personal faith experiences. That eruption will not come from nowhere. It grows in soil already disturbed by earlier debates about authority and reason. Boston's skyline in 1729 still appears modest. Church steeples, warehouses, wooden homes. But its intellectual skyline has expanded dramatically. Perhaps the most profound consequence, however, is psychological resilience. The smallpox epidemic did not destroy the town. Economic fluctuations did not starve it into submission. Political disagreements did not tear it apart. Collective survival builds confidence, and confidence changes posture. A community that believes it can endure hardship becomes less fearful of confrontation. By mid-century, when imperial tensions sharpen after global wars, Boston will respond not as a fragile outpost but as a seasoned survivor. Even architecture reflects these shifts. Brick buildings begin replacing some wooden structures, signalling permanence. Investment in infrastructure, wharves, roads, public buildings, suggests expectation of longevity. People build not as temporary settlers, but as inhabitants of a future city. That mindset is new compared to earlier generations who viewed the colony as experiment or refuge. Now it feels like home. Home is worth defending. Home is worth arguing about. Home is worth reshaping. There are darker consequences too. Economic growth deepens class divides. Merchant elites accumulate influence that can overshadow poorer labourers. Tensions between rich and poor simmer quietly, setting stage for populist anger later. Urban density increases vulnerability to future fires and disease outbreaks. Expansion brings fragility alongside strength. Nothing is purely triumphant, but that complexity is itself a consequence. Boston has moved beyond simple narratives of godly mission or obedient colony. It now contains competing interests, layered identities, moral paradoxes. It has become modern in miniature. When we look ahead from the vantage point of the 1720s, we do not see revolution yet. We see rehearsal. Rehearsal in argument. Rehearsal in survival. Rehearsal in contradiction. Everyday life, hauling water, mending nets, counting coins, praying in pews, quietly constructed the emotional and institutional scaffolding that would support seismic change later. History often spotlights climactic moments. Tea thrown into harbours, muskets fired on village greens. But those moments stand on decades like this one. Without the inoculation debates, later disputes over parliamentary authority would lack precedent. Without the economic entanglement of Atlantic trade, later boycotts would lack leverage. Without town meeting culture, later revolutionary committees would lack procedural DNA. Without moral contradiction over slavery, later struggles over freedom would lack urgency. The long-term consequences of the 1720s are not loud. They are foundational. They turn Boston from settlement into society, from dependent outpost into self-aware community, from fragile experiment into emerging power centre. As the decade closes, ships still sail under British flags, governors still answer to the crown, sermons still invoke divine order. But beneath these continuities a new layer has hardened, a belief, tentative but growing, that this town has agency. Agency is dangerous, agency is liberating, agency is the quiet inheritance of the 1720s, and once inherited it rarely disappears. Transformation rarely announces itself with trumpets. It arrives disguised as habit. By the time the 1720s fade into memory, the people of Boston do not wake one morning declaring themselves transformed. They are still fishermen, printers, midwives, merchants, enslaved labourers, apprentices, ministers. The harbour still smells of salt and tar. Bells still mark the hours. But beneath the repetition of daily life, identities have shifted. At the start of the decade, Boston thought of itself primarily as a fragile moral experiment under the authority of Great Britain, a distant extension of empire and Protestant mission. By the end, it has begun to see itself as something more autonomous, more complicated, more self-defining. That is the arc. The transformation begins internally. Take Samuel again, merchant, husband, father. In 1720, his ambition is straightforward. Profit within imperial rules. Keep ships moving. avoid conflict with customs officials, trust that stability flows downward from London. But the decade test that trust. Trade regulations fluctuate, disease disrupts port traffic, local debates challenge authority. Samuel learns not just to follow policy, but to interpret it, bend around it, anticipate it. He studies not only prices but politics. He becomes strategic. This shift from obedience to strategy is subtle yet profound. It means he no longer sees himself as a passive recipient of imperial decisions. He becomes an actor navigating power structures. Multiply Samuel by hundreds of merchants, and you see the transformation. They are still British subjects, proudly so, but they no longer feel powerless within the system. Meanwhile, Mercy's transformation unfolds in quieter ways. At the beginning of the decade, her world feels bounded by home, church, market stall. She measures time in chores and seasons. Public affairs drift through her life indirectly, but smallpox invades domestic space. Economic policy alters household budgets. Political arguments echo through dinner conversations. She cannot vote. She cannot speak in town meetings. Yet she becomes politically literate by necessity. She learns which goods are scarce because of trade restrictions. She understands which ministers support inoculation and which condemn it. She tracks the mood of neighbours, anxious, defiant, resentful. Her transformation is cognitive. She begins to see that the private sphere is not insulated from public power, that awareness will ripple forward. When later boycotts of British goods demand domestic enforcement, women like Mercy will not be starting from ignorance. They will draw on a decade of indirect engagement, and then there is Kwame. His arc is the most haunting. In 1720 he is newly arrived, stripped from homeland, inserted into a society debating theology and trade as if these are universal concerns. At first his focus is survival. Learn language, avoid punishment, observe. But as the decade progresses, he hears colonists articulate ideas about rights, representation, liberty. He watches them argue against distant authority while exercising absolute authority over him. Cognitive dissonance sharpens into insight. Kwame's transformation is not into freedom, not yet. It is into awareness of hypocrisy and possibility. He begins to understand the ideological tools being forged around him. Those tools will matter later, not only for him, but for generations who inherit his condition. The town's religious identity also shifts. In earlier generations, ministers wielded near-total authority. Doctrine was community glue. Dissent felt existentially dangerous. The inoculation controversy fractures that certainty. When a respected minister supports medical experimentation based on evidence, and another condemns it as sinful interference with divine will, congregants must choose whom to trust. Trust becomes conditional. Faith does not vanish, but it becomes personal, interpretive. This is transformation from theocracy toward pluralism, not a clean break, but a gradual loosening. By decade's end, Bostonians are more accustomed to disagreement within their own religious community. That normalization prepares the ground for future revivalist movements that will challenge established churches. Even the physical environment reflects change. Brick buildings begin replacing some older wooden structures. Wealth funds sturdier wharves. Streets grow busier, more layered with noise and commerce. Architecture signals permanence. A settlement builds in wood. A city builds in brick. Boston is becoming a city, not merely in size but in mentality. Cities breed complexity. They demand negotiation among diverse interests. They foster anonymity alongside intimacy. They generate ideas through friction. The transformation arc of the 1720s is precisely this movement, from simplicity toward complexity. Earlier narratives of Boston framed it as a city upon a hill, morally unified, divinely guided, ideologically coherent. By the end of the decade, that myth has thinned. Reality is messier. Merchants profit from trade networks that include enslaved labour. Ministers argue publicly about science. Citizens debate imperial policy while relying on imperial protection. Class divides widen even as communal identity strengthens. The transformation is not toward purity, it is toward maturity. Maturity acknowledges contradiction without collapsing. And with maturity comes confidence. Confidence changes how a community carries itself. In small gestures you see it. A printer publishes a mildly critical essay about trade law, trusting that backlash will be manageable. A merchant negotiates more aggressively with a British supplier. A town meeting pushes back against a governor's directive with firmer language than would have been used decades earlier. No revolution yet. But posture has shifted. Perhaps the most profound transformation lies in temporal perspective. Early colonists often thought in terms of survival, getting through winter, avoiding famine, resisting attack. By the late 1720s, Bostonians think generationally. They invest in education, they expand print culture, they plan infrastructure improvements, they debate not just immediate policy but future direction. This long view signals self-perception as enduring society. Enduring societies demand voice, and voice, once tasted, becomes addictive. The harbour still flies British flags. The King's authority remains intact. But psychologically, Boston is no longer a child of empire. It is an adolescent, testing boundaries, discovering capacity, wrestling with identity. Adolescence is unstable. It contains defiance and insecurity simultaneously. Boston of the 1720s embodies that tension, proudly British, increasingly self-conscious, dependent, restless. The transformation arc does not culminate in dramatic break this decade. It culminates in a new baseline, a baseline where dissent is normal, where economic strategy includes political calculation, where domestic life is recognized as influenced by global forces, where enslaved individuals quietly absorb rhetoric that will one day challenge the system, where religion coexists with reason in uneasy partnership. The town that emerges from the 1720s is not the same town that entered it. It has been tested by disease. It has argued over science. It has navigated imperial policy. It has tasted both prosperity and vulnerability, and in doing so, it has shed the illusion of simplicity. Transformation does not always produce clarity. Sometimes it produces awareness. Awareness that identity is constructed, awareness that power can be questioned, awareness that survival breeds strength. By 1730, Boston stands on its harbour shore looking much the same to passing ships, but inside its meeting houses, kitchens, docks and print shops, a quieter revolution has already occurred. The people have changed, and when people change, history eventually follows. History does not whisper its lessons. It waits for us to ask better questions. When we look at everyday life in 1720s Boston, we're not just observing wooden houses and salt-stiffened sails. We're studying how ordinary people navigated uncertainty without knowing they were standing on the edge of transformation. The wisdom is not abstract, it is practical. First lesson: resilience is built before crisis, not during it. When smallpox arrived, Boston did not suddenly invent courage. The town had already developed habits of communal organization, town meetings, church networks, maritime coordination. Those structures allowed information to circulate, debates to happen, decisions to be made. Crisis exposed the strength of the foundation. In modern life, We often treat emergencies as isolated disruptions, but Boston teaches us that survival depends on everyday investment in community before disaster strikes. Second lesson: dissent is a civic muscle. The inoculation controversy did not destroy Boston, it stretched it. When ministers and physicians publicly disagreed, when citizens shouted in streets, the town experienced social strain, but it also practiced negotiation. It discovered that disagreement does not automatically equal collapse. That realization is powerful. Societies that fear disagreement suppress it until pressure explodes. Societies that tolerate debate build endurance. Boston in the 1720s learned to argue and remain intact. Third lesson: